Good evening. I'm Vishwa Sadashivan. Welcome to the third edition of Inconvenient Questions, or IQ Special. For the next 2 hours, we will be discussing, and quite robustly I'm sure, two very important, relevant and related issues: income inequality and social mobility. President Barack Obama said in 2013, and I quote him, "A dangerous and growing inequality is the defining challenge of our time." Now, across the world, we are seeing the rise of angry and frustrated underclass. There's a cognitive dissonance between the needs, aspirations, and desire of those at the base of the social pyramid and what the reality is. Now, just last month, the world saw this play out with emotional aggression in Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. The truth is, no country is spared. No matter how much you try, income inequality and the sensitivity to it are on the rise. In Singapore, Senior Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam presented the challenge quite plainly, and he said, I quote, "These trends have weakened the sense of togetherness in many societies. Where there was once a strong we, there is now them versus us." Even though the government has been playing the activist role in support of social mobility, there appears to be growing discontentment, even in Singapore. Singaporeans are asking for a more level playing field and even questioning the conventional wisdom of meritocracy. So, how do we tackle this? Should the focus be on fixing income inequality or enhancing social mobility? Are the two correlated? Indeed, what are the actual obstacles? Is it really just about money and education, or is it also about culture and values? What can we learn from the USA, from China, and the experience of the Nordic countries? Are we prepared to go beyond tweaks and make fundamental changes? To help us make sense of this, we have put together a sterling panel of experts. Professor Danny Quah, Dean and Lee Ka-shing Professor of Economics at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and a leading global specialist on macroeconomics and econometrics. Dr. Noeleen Heyzer served as Under-Secretary General in the United Nations from 2007 to 2014. She was the first woman to lead the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, a mouthful, or ESCAP, and she championed shared prosperity and social equity in the Southeast Asia region. Inderjit Singh is a serial, not killer, but entrepreneur and former PAP MP for almost 20 years. When he is not busy as a CEO and being an entrepreneurial guru, he makes time to champion the interests of those in the lower income segment of society. Last, but certainly not least, the lady in a hat, Anthea Indira Ong, is a full-time social entrepreneur and social advocate. A former nominated Member of Parliament, Anthea is a compelling voice in the public discourse on social inequality and social inclusion. The topic for today, income inequality, is it the real issue? We'll start by having one panelist lead in making a substantive presentation for 10 minutes, and no more, Danny. So we kick off with Professor Danny Quah, sharing his research findings on the issues of income inequality and social mobility. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you, Vishwas. As Vishwas has suggested, I'm actually going to argue that income inequality is not the real challenge. Income inequality is not the issue, and in a number of instances that I will try and outline, income inequality is actually a distraction. It takes us away from the real challenge. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, gosh, he looks meek and mild-mannered. He doesn't have horns on his head. There are no vampire fangs that I can see on him. How can he say such terrible, heinous things to argue that income inequality is not the problem? So I would like to develop the case in the time that I've got in 3 steps. The first is I want to go through some examples where we think income inequality has been a real challenge, but I'm going to argue that that's been misdirected, the attention. I'm going to argue that actually social mobility, equality of opportunity are far more important things to look at than just the mere fact of income inequality alone. Second, I'm going to set down some principles. I want to argue that those who are concerned for the position of the weak and vulnerable in society should be concerned about the position of the weak and vulnerable in society. And we should be focused, laser-like, in alleviating, in improving their circumstances. But that is not going to come out of distractions put in our way by looking at income inequality. Again, income inequality is not the problem. And then I'm going to conclude in the time that I've got with sharing some of the numbers, some of the figures, some of the social experiences that we see not just in Singapore, but around the world. These statistics, I'll be light on them, but confirm the line of thinking I want to present to you. So first, let's begin. The course of this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has actually confirmed for many of us the terrible things that happen with inequality. Let me fully put that on the table. In newspaper outlets, from Today Online, Straits Times, New York Times, the FT, Time Magazine, we see story after story of two vignettes. One of the rich in society who have plenty of technology, plenty of space to do work from home, to have their children schooled from home in pleasant, comfortable circumstances. Their children are sitting in front of 3 large PC screens, taking in all the wisdom that online learning has to offer. One vignette. Second vignette, different family. It's the same picture across many societies. This family is poorer, lives in the lower part of the income distribution. The offspring, the children, have old computers seated on not proper desks, but wooden boxes, makeshift platforms for doing their schoolwork. Okay. Their parents are closed in, are not able to go to work. Inequality, the ravages of COVID-19 have sharpened out for all of us observers the dramatic difference in experience across the rich and the poor, across different parts of an income inequality divide. That's the story we are told over and over. What's wrong with that story? Let me suggest a thought. The terrible things that the poor family, the offspring in the poor family have to go through, they would have to go through exactly those same challenges whether that society had rich people or did not have rich people. People who don't have resources to do homeschooling, who don't have resources to work from home, indeed are told if they're manual laborers not to come into work and therefore suffer further falls in already a lower income. That would happen to them whether or not there was rich people in their society. If there were no rich people in society, it would just happen to all of them. If there were some rich people in society, these terrible consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic would happen to just the poorer. But the point is, the terrible experience, the life-draining experience that they have to go through, the inevitable permanent consequences on the schooling of their children, that will happen because they are poor, not because society is unequal. But of course, wait a minute, someone will say, isn't it the case that given that society is unequal, shouldn't we be redistributing resources from the rich to the poor to alleviate the life experience of those at the bottom of the income distribution? And I would say, yes, you might be able to do that. But notice that argument that we've just made is not an indictment of inequality. Instead, it is a statement about how we can improve the situation of the poor because they are rich in society. It's actually a statement that we can improve the well-being of the poor because of inequality, not an indictment of inequality. So this unpacking of this now canonical picture of the rich and the poor having such sharp different experiences across, over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic has grabbed the imagination. It has inflamed so many of us with a passion about the terrible things that inequality does to a society. But at base, it is a story that's misleading and is wrong. And it inflames in us passions of us versus them. It doesn't tell us that society is in this all together. It focuses on exactly the wrong policy challenge. Someone will further say, however, wait a minute though, I do accept that. So, but there are still other reasons why we might be not sanguine about sharp inequality. No question. When inequality, disparities between rich and poor attain extreme high levels, there's no question that those who feel excluded from the elites in society are angry. And that anger changes the calculation that they make about their actions. They might take action against the very rich. Similarly, the very rich are even more incentivized to keep the poor away. Very sharp inequality does polarize society. But the way to solve that is not through removing inequality, but to provide those who are weak and vulnerable at the bottom of the income distribution pathways up towards better life outcomes for themselves, equality of opportunity. No one should be excluded from achieving their potential because of barriers of poverty, deprivation upon their birth. We should certainly repair that. That is a challenge in social mobility. That is a challenge about the social compact. It is not a challenge introduced by the fact of income inequality alone. Let me finish. I promised the two other things that I would say, principles. So here's the principle. Indeed, I am concerned about the weak and vulnerable in society. I think that poverty, deprivation, social immobility themselves represent social dysfunction and in turn cause all other kinds of social ills. And it is that we should focus laser-like on repairing. Whether income inequality is high or low, rising or falling, is actually irrelevant in that discussion. Income inequality in some cases provides us an opportunity. It is not in itself the villain. And then in closing, let me say, across the world, we see a bewildering array of real-life experiences. In some societies, income inequality is rising, and the situation of the poor, they are being immiserized. America is in that situation. Singapore, the opposite. Income inequality is high, rising moderately, but the poor are being lifted hugely. Income inequality is not the villain. Social immobility is the real challenge. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Danny. Looking at the expressions of your audience, especially on this side, I think, you're going to get a lot of inconvenient questions coming your way. No, but I'm glad that you raised this because it's a very interesting idea. It's a very interesting proposal. It's very different from conventional wisdom, and I think we need these sort of discourses. Now, you didn't have the time perhaps to talk about this, but would you want to just quickly mention the research on China?
Okay, so the research that I do picks up on these ideas. So it looks at what happens across different countries. I said America is a nation where inequality is high, it continues to rise, and the poor are actually immiserized. It's the opposite of social mobility.
And this is over decades.
This is over 4 decades,
Okay.
the last 4 decades. China, too, has a high and rising inequality. But in China, the poor are having incomes rise at a rate faster than even the rich in America are having incomes rise.
So your point is that China's experience shows you that there's not much of a correlation between income inequality, because income inequality has risen at a much higher, faster pace than USA, right?
Yes.
Yet
The poor are doing very well. Social mobility is present in China. Let me conclude with the last fact. But is China so different from everybody else? Is the world more like America or more like China? Singapore's experience in this is more like China. It's even happier than China's. In 80% of the cases around the world over the last 4 decades, where income inequality has risen, so too have incomes at the bottom of the income distribution in those societies. Most of the world is more like China and Singapore than they are like America. But America is so powerful, so vivid in social media, in media. We all think that when income inequality rises, the poor must be immiserized. Yes, indeed, that does happen. It happens in America, the world's most powerful economy. But it doesn't happen in most other places in the world.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Danny. Yes, Nolan.
Okay, so I was very interested in terms of your 80% of the world actually have got out of poverty and so on. And I think that's something that we need to celebrate. But I would say where I agree with you is that to understand that, we definitely need to go beyond one-dimensional analysis of just income or the economics. So I'm a social scientist, so I look at other things, right? So I would say that we got there because of 4 different things. One is the fact that people had agency to actually destroy the chains of historical inequalities, be it colonialism or imperialism, China, feudalism, and so on, right? So there was, in a sense, a revolution, if you like, of people taking agency and people being empowered to define the social arrangements that they want in order to uplift their own people, in order to create social and economic progress and get people out of poverty. So basically, it was a choice, it was a decision, and it was of value. Thirdly, there was something called, at that time when I was studying, the developmental state. So you had decision-making, policy choices, very much from the perspective of the population that were largely poor and disadvantaged. So you have the role of the developmental state. But you also had, at that time, after the Second World War, international solidarity and cooperation in actually developing a rule-based multilateral order that allowed the big, the poor, and the disadvantaged countries to actually take on the agenda of economic and social development, right? Now, so that I call the Great Escape. So the Great Escape did not just come from the economics, but it came actually from the coming together of the political, the solidarity, the partnership, the type of social arrangements and the policy choices that have been made, right? Now the second thing that I want to talk about is the Great Divide. I think by focusing just on income inequality, and you forget that we can't just talk about the individual. We can't just talk about the individual rising in social mobility, because it hides many, many other realities. So as a social scientist, I look at what I call the Great Divides. And there are 2 great divides. No, I'm sorry, I have to have a bit more time. It's a bit unfair.
Okay.
at the Great Divide, one is actually the horizontal inequality, the exclusions around social groups. And one of the biggest exclusion happens to be gender inequality. So even when you have women, right, actually getting into the workforce and actually improving and increasing their mobility measured through income, what they don't have is dignity and voice and rights. And one very good example, if any of you remember, for me, recently, just several years ago, in 2013, was the Rana Plaza incident in Bangladesh. Most of the women were seen as huge, as actually undergoing huge social mobility because they came from the rural areas, they went to the urban areas, and they worked in factories, they had incomes, and so on. They were forced to work and to go into work when the buildings were cracked, and it was shaking, and they begged not to be allowed to work, and they were refused. Their voice was not attended to. There was no sense of dignity. They were all forced into work and they were said that if you don't, you will lose your work, right? What happened? 1,132 young women were buried alive. 2,500 people were injured, all right? So in a sense, that is the meaning of the fact that if you don't look at other forms of inequalities in terms of dignity, in terms of rights, in terms of voice, you are actually not understanding the importance of a divided society. The other thing, and I will stop here and I will come in later, but I need to
you can
talk
come in
about
later,
this.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the other divide is the fact that whilst we are dealing with the existing inequalities, because, you know, with the Millennium Development Goals, we were all asked to halve the world's absolute poverty, which we did, and Danny has mentioned that already. But what happened to the other half? So there are many inequalities that are unresolved, but that's not enough. Because our young, the other divide is an intergenerational divide between us and the youth, especially in the context of the COVID-19 situation that Danny was talking about. Because they are faced with pandemic that have caused joblessness on the scale that we have not seen. In fact, 150 million people have been forced back into poverty, extreme poverty. The other thing is that they are faced with a technological disruption that will change the whole nature of work. And then thirdly, you have the climate change agenda. So they are faced with a future of uncertainty and also of anxiety. And in a sense, we have to find a way of dealing with the intergenerational inequality issues, which is the other divide. So one is a gender divide, and the other is the intergenerational divide. I have some policy options going forward, but I will stop there.
I promise you I'll give you enough time later.
No,
right.
but
it's interesting. So your point is we need to go beyond the numbers. We need to go beyond economics per se, because there are a lot of other issues that are hidden.
Yes.
Right, and you highlighted some of those in the form of divides.
Yeah.
Interesting. Indigit.
Yeah, thanks. I think income equality is an important measure, to look at the progress of society, and social mobility, of course, is important. But the income equality is the beginning of the problem of social mobility. I teach entrepreneurship nowadays at NTU, and I did some research on the disruption. Basically, even pre-COVID, I mean, the world was going through Industry 4.0, and disruption was really destroying many things that norms that we are used to. And there's one survey that I looked at, and the question asked people of different countries. This was a simple question: is the world getting better or worse? The only country in the world where the population said that the world is getting better, more than 50%, was China. And every other country in that survey, the results were less than 50%, so it's getting worse. And Singapore, the United States, UK, and many of the EU countries, we were talking about 60 to 80% saying that it's getting worse, not better.
Better in what sense?
is the world getting better for you?
In general.
In general.
Okay.
And so, so I read this as whether the quality of life, is improving or becoming worse. And now then I look at the bottom 10 countries that said it's getting bad. Of the 10, 8 countries have seen turmoil. France, US, Brexit in UK, government change in Belgium, Finland. Only 2 countries, Hong Kong also is there. Only 2 countries escaped this turmoil are Singapore and Australia. Now, Australia surprised me, but Singapore I can understand for the reasons that Danny mentioned, because the government intervention has been quite significant. So I think this is something that we need to look at. Now, why China is the only one? Because China is the only country where wages have improved, especially for lower and the middle income.
Base.
And if you look at the general population in the world, for all the developed countries, the wages of middle income has gotten worse. Poor remain poor, and the wages of middle income is becoming worse and worse, US, Singapore included. So China, of course, and we went through that phase when our wages were going up, so things became better. So I would read China's data, with caution. That and trying to link it with Singapore, I think I worry about that kind of conclusion. So we thus far Singapore government has done a great job in intervening at various levels, and I don't worry so much about the very poor in Singapore. I worry about the ones above the very poor.
You talk about the sandwich class.
Sandwich class, because they effectively, in terms of buying power, are probably getting poorer. Now, so I'm an engineer, not an economist or social scientist, but so for me, as an engineer, I look at it in very structured form. There are 2 parts of this problem. One is income, so which measures income equality. The other part of the equation is the denominator, which is the cost of living. Whether, for the incomes, whether they rise, are the incomes rising faster than the cost of living? And I think Singapore suffers that problem of cost of living moving at a faster rate than income rise. And so I think similarly, if we look at countries around the world, we really have to look at affordability and quality of life if we want to look at lives improving, and whether people are going to answer the next time we do the survey, is the world getting a better place? So I'll stop here and then
So your point essentially is we need to look at what we mean by a better place.
Yes.
Is it about cost of living? Is it about income growth? Or is it about quality of life?
Yeah, that's right.
Am I correct?
Yes.
That's the thrust of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes, Anthea.
Thank you. So being the last person, you will be just nodding your head because actually that's like what you're really gonna say. I'm gonna just actually just make it quick so that we have more time for the free flow discussion. I think it's a really interesting proposition that you have actually raised, Danny. To not be distracted by income inequality, and I see that as aspirational if that's what we want to do, because if we think about our society today, and I'm going to use Singapore as the case study, right? If income is not an important proxy, how is it that the income of our friends from the low income communities is being used as a means testing, right? So if that's not important, and we should look at social mobility, then I would argue that, and I hope friends here who is actually working with our vulnerable communities would support me to say that then we shouldn't then look at just income, in assessing what they need. Because obviously that would mean that income is a very important proxy, right, at the policy level, but also maybe at the economic level. And I don't remember a lot of my economics, although I did enjoy my time, doing economics in school right here on this campus.
If you enjoyed, that means you didn't learn much.
I know, right? Yeah. I know, that's why I'm saying that cannot remember a lot. But I would want to ask, and maybe actually not maybe just ask, but also think about the fact that if we look at the fact that, I think Danny mentioned, that the poor will still be poor, whether there are any rich persons, right, in the society. But if I remember correctly, economics is all about scarcity, right? It's all about how we have finite resources, And therefore, I would actually like to ask, given that, wouldn't the rich be able to get rich only because or only if the poor stays poor or they get poorer, right? And I think because of that, income as a proxy, which we do it all in Singapore, and it's not just for means testing. We know that to apply for a credit card, it's based on your income as well. So it's really, really omnipresent, if you ask me, right, about this sort of focus on income. And therefore, I think on that note, I would suggest that we don't, and to Nolene's point, and even to Inderjit's point, that yes, I agree, we shouldn't just focus on income, but income inequality is a starting point for us to know how marginalized, certain communities in our society is. And at the same time, I think it allows us to look at all the horizontal inequalities or intersectional inequalities that Nolene talked about. I would also argue that if we want to look at how to make our society more equal, and I'm going to quote Aristotle that says that the worst thing about inequality is you're trying to make unequal things equal, right? So I think if we want to do that, then we have to start looking at a bigger set of indicators, right? Not just social mobility, not just income inequality, but let's look at dignity. Let's look at social esteem. Let's look at, what are meaningful, respectful jobs that we're giving to our workers, right? Especially our low-wage workers. And we all know that the economic value very much equates to social value right now in our society. So I think, in short, I would say that income inequality may not be the real culprit, but I don't think we can completely just put it aside. I think they are so completely symbiotic with social mobility, with dignity, and going back to, whether I have a good quality of life. And that would be my take on.
Yeah. So essentially, your point is, if I understand you correctly, we can't just look at income, whether it's inequality or otherwise. We can't just look at income as a factor, because as you said, Inderjit, there's also cost of living.
Yeah.
There are various other factors, and there are softer issues that are very important for us not to forget. I like the point you raised about finite resources. In fact, that's something that came to my mind, because yes, it is true that it may be true that just because you have rich people doesn't mean that you won't have poor people. You'll eradicate the problem. That's not, I don't think that is really, for me, at the center of the equation.
Yeah.
I was thinking hard about it, right? When society is bifurcated, where you have a substantial segment of society that's rich, and a substantial segment of society that is not well off, you will have disgruntlement.
Yep. Yeah.
Right? Now, I was recalling when I was doing my PSLE. It feels like 200 years ago, but actually it wasn't that long ago. It was 1971, 77. Wow. Sorry, 71. Now, I did fairly well, and I got into Raffles Institution. Right? You know what? Close to 90% of us were from poor families. I don't think they tweaked meritocracy to ensure that only the poor got into RI. Yeah. It's just that the vast majority of Singapore was poor. There was no bifurcation.
Yeah.
The vast majority was poor, and we went in there, and there was no issue of inequality. You didn't sense it. In fact, the guys who got ragged and whacked were the rich ones, right? And that was, it's almost communist, a small percentage of them. Now, fast forward today, I would say about 90% of the students who go to Raffles Institution, which normally takes in the top 1% PSLE scorers, right? 90% of them, I believe, come from well-off families. Now, what does this show? Again, it's not that the government is intentionally now putting the rich into RI. No, it's meritocracy. But the point is, because the resources of education is finite, when one occupies a seat, the other loses it. Now, which way do you think the equation is going to go? It's not that the poor are going to occupy it and then the rich are going to lose the seats. That would be called affirmative action, which is not very popular in Singapore at least. But it seems to be all right if the rich dominate that finite resources. Now, do you know that the top quintile of society spends 5 times more in private tuition than the bottom quintile?
Yeah.
See, when you have the resources,
course.
because you are rich, you have the resources, you will make sure that your child understand primary 6 mathematics, which I bet, Indrajit, you can't do.
And that actually was what is the real problem, all right? Because at the end of the day, one needs to look at equality of opportunities and quality education, especially when you're shifting into a knowledge-based economy, is so critical. Now, the point is that the government in Singapore actually privilege quality education in the early stages for everyone, right? But then when you have societies that are unequal, then of course you're going to use your resources to capture what is the privilege pathway to a better life and to a higher quality life. The main thing now is what I think the Singapore actually government, through policy making, is realizing that you cannot use birth lottery as a way of going forward, because you cannot really depend on who you're born to and what all that will entail, right? So what they have done is to actually invest in early childhood education. And that, I think, is absolutely critical, because then it gives you, independent of income, a possibility to actually compete. But still, it's not an equal, it's not
reduces,
at all.
It reduces the disadvantage.
But it does not create a level playing field.
I'll have to stop you there. Danny has been dying to speak. Yes, Danny.
I wanted to just pick up on this last strand of the conversation.
You can pick up on all the strands.
I'm very happy to do that. I'm intrigued, Vishwas, because the way you said it is also the way I think about it. Those families who are rich can buy extra tuition. The statement is not because there's inequality in society, some people can buy extra tuition. It's that those who are rich can afford to do so. Those who are poor cannot. But the statement is conditioned on your level of income. How rich you are, not where you are in the income distribution, not where you are relative to others. See, the point is that we are so used to thinking about this game of life as a zero-sum game. What someone gets, someone else has to do without. Anthea, your statement was, I'm interested. I'm keen to think about all these as possibilities, but isn't it just possible that the rich have become rich because they've taken advantage of the poor? They've taken something away from the poor. That might well happen in certain societies. In other societies, there's rule of law, there is possession, there's property rights, and that kind of expropriation doesn't happen. The world is not zero sum. Indeed, everything that we tell our young, be entrepreneurs, create wealth, figure out ways to add value, none of those would make any sense if the world was zero sum, because they could only create wealth, add value by taking away from someone else. Why would we tell our young to take away from someone else? Creating wealth, adding value expands the pie. And by expanding the pie, that is how we bring people out of poverty, out of dire initial circumstance.
Noelin is dying to say. Go ahead, Noelin.
How do you know?
I can see from the passion that is oozing through your eyes.
All right, okay. Okay, so let me put it in another way, Danny.
Don't try too hard to be polite.
I'm not polite, but I'm trying to. All right. The thing is that one has to look at the nature of economic growth, right? So for a very long time, the economic growth that we actually took on, or many countries took on, was highly dependent on low-wage labor, especially of women and of migrant workers, and including actually enfranchising a lot of the population, including the undocumented migrants and so on, right? So a lot of it is actually based on low-wage labor. And of course, in the process, what many countries have done, including Singapore, is to try to build up your human capital and then to move out of this framework and to improve the quality of growth. And only with improving the quality of growth, taking care of your human resources, and now you're talking about the skills future, you're asking for greater health security at the workplace, less harassment at the workplace. So you're trying to improve the quality of growth. But at the same time, unless you're very clear that what you want is inclusive development that feeds into the well-being of not just human beings, but of the planet. So the well-being of people and planet as part of the economic growth agenda, you're going to exploit it. And we have seen how people have been exploited and how the planet has been exploited in terms of natural resources. So I think how you create the well-being framework and finance the well-being framework is absolutely critical.
Olene, let me say something shocking. I agree completely with you.
You're not supposed to, Danny. How can you?
No disagreement at all with you on this last point. Who would be against inclusive development? Inclusive development is where everybody becomes better off, including those who began not so well off. I am completely for that. Our job in terms of economic development around the world is not complete. We have lots still to do. None of this, however, speaks against inequality. None of this is a statement about how inequality is an obstacle to inclusive development. It's not. Indeed, exactly the statistics that I mentioned. On China, for instance, income inequality rose. It brought 627 million people out of extreme poverty at the same time. That is the single largest inclusive development in all 7 million years of human history. And it came with increased inequality. So again, I fall back. Inequality is not the critical central challenge. We should not be distracted by. Imagine in 1979, when 90% of China's population was still in extreme poverty. Deng Xiaoping looked ahead to the next 40 years and said, if we go along this path, it really goes against our socialist roots because inequality might rise. If he had halted the process at that time, not listened to Lee Kuan Yew about the process of manufacturing, export-oriented, shifting labor out of the rural areas, the world would not have lifted 600 million people out of poverty. If we had paid attention to the naysayers on income inequality, humanity would be a much more miserable state right now than it is. That is inclusive development, and that is completely consistent with income inequality. Let me also say, I agree with you on many things that you've said. Incomes should not be the single index of how well-off societies are. At the same time, income is highly correlated with how well-off people are.
Yeah.
What gives people agency? What allows them to control their destiny? Access to resources. What gives them access to resources? Among other things, income. Other things matter too, of course, but income is an imperfect but highly correlated indicator of how well-off people are. So I'm the first to say it's not perfect, but a lot of things go along with it. And if it didn't, we wouldn't be talking about minimum wages as a way to reduce the suffering of the weak and vulnerable.
So-
Minimum wages by increasing people's incomes, the progressive wage model by increasing people's incomes at the bottom of the income distribution helps lift people, and we think that's a good thing. If income weren't the issue, we wouldn't have protests around the world at the top 1%.
Okay, I'll have to stop you there. I would suggest, so that we can include, since we're talking about inclusivity, let's include our studio audience at this point in time. I think we've discussed enough about income inequality and so on. I'd like to now shift the discussion a little bit more closer to home and ask this simple question, right? What do you think are the critical levers, regardless of income inequality and so on, what do you think are the critical levers that as a society we need to focus on, right, to lift the bottom, right? I mean, putting aside this issue of income inequality for the time being, what do you think we need to focus on? Clearly, education is one, right? I mean, education as a social leveler, we need to do that. And Singapore does focus on that. It has been. And of course, healthcare, and so on. So there are a few other things. But are there specific actions that we can focus on? Specific areas we can focus on, levers we can pull to make society more equal, instead of talking about inequality, more equal, giving more opportunities.
Yeah,
to people,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just throw it open to the audience. Anyone? Please introduce yourself very briefly before you start.
Okay, is it on?
Don't worry, it's on.
It's on. Okay, my name is Raja. I'm with Sinda, but I've been an educator most of my life. I listened to the panelists and I felt that one really thing that was not explored was, I think in equality of opportunities is important. But I think in Singapore, meritocracy is too narrowly defined, right? How I would like to explain this is that, because you see, people must have hope, right? And if, as Viswa mentioned, right, meritocracy, you do well, intellectually you're good, you enter the top schools and all that. But if we look at it, if a person is skilled in another area, right, if we define meritocracy in a broader sense, and this goes to how we structure the different vocations also, right? Is there equal opportunity to progress in every single vocation? We are working on it with Skills Future and the progressive wage model. But the escalator is not as long for some vocations as for others, right? And it's also partly due to how we have structured the workforce. I mean, we also depend largely on a lot of migrant workers in certain, productivity is very low in certain sectors. So I think, because if we want to move and have opportunities for everybody, then I think there should be an equality of opportunity for everyone. Meritocracy must be more broadly defined. Good, respectable jobs must be everywhere. And there must be ability for people to progress. So that's my take, and I just wanted to ask the panelists what do they feel about this?
Before I throw it open to the panel, I just want to add a rejoinder, right? There's also this whole prejudice against blue-collar work, right?
Exactly.
This is, and income is actually related to the perception of
That's
blue-collar work,
absolutely
right?
Yeah.
Now, and let's face it, a significant percentage of our population is blue-collar, right? And until and unless, you see, you can keep increasing, progressive wage model increase, but you see, if the perception of blue-collar jobs is that it is socially lower in standing,
Yeah.
you're not going to see enough people going there and taking those jobs. And if enough good people don't take those jobs, you're going to have a vicious cycle. So the point I'm making is we have to go beyond economics and look at values that our society has. I think after 55 years, we definitely should rethink the way we look at jobs. Today, we look at jobs and give importance to jobs based on how much that job commands in terms of money.
It's a proxy.
Yeah. Recently we had political leaders actually saying that anyone who earns less than $500,000 is mediocre. No, those things are very, very troubling,
Yeah.
you know, because there are social workers who have chosen to be in social sector because they want to make a difference, and you can't expect the social sector to pay you $500,000. But does that mean that that particular social worker is mediocre? No, these signals are dangerous. And I think these things are fundamental, you know, in terms of how we define ourselves as a society, what are the values we embrace, and what are the values we are prepared to let go of.
So
On that, I'd like to hear just one quick question or comment from Cindy.
Yeah, Cindy from Methodist Welfare Services. I wanted to respond to your question about levers. So what would be some levers that would actually enable, right, and allow us to actually address the issue? I think a lot of the concerns that we talked about in terms of, you know, what's our values or what's our principles that we integrate into our society has a lot got to do with actually social participation. So actually one of the major levers that's hardly talked about is actually social participation. And I think as we speak, those of us who work primarily on the ground, when you were all talking, like pictures, names and faces of people just keeps appearing in my head. And I go like, what do these people need? What do these people want? And actually they want to be acknowledged. They want to be able to have discourse with us at this platform. So they want to be able to sit with the panelists and go, this is my life. And this is my life and I can talk about it. So the public discourse is important. The participation of being able to engage in social activities together equally is critical. So how does that happen? It doesn't happen overnight because we are all human beings, right? And we judge. So it starts by actually being accepting and being able to have conversations and take risks with one another. So I would suggest actually that, I don't have the perfect answer for this, but I would suggest that one of the basic levers on top of education and healthcare and income, rising income, is actually social participation. So I just would like to maybe hear comments on that.
Great point. I just want two more quick comments from the audience before we throw it back to the panel. Yes, Zubaida.
I just wanted to add on to what Cindy said actually.
Ranga,
because
you
I
want
think
to introduce yourself?
Oh, hi, I'm Ranga. I'm from Beyond Social Services. We work with very low-income families. And I wanted to actually take on from the point that Cindy mentioned, as well as Dr. Hazer, because you mentioned the word agency. And I think one of the things that's greatly missing in our value system is agency for the poor. And actually, the inconvenient question should be asked by the people who are inconvenienced. So I would actually then suggest, Vishwa, that you do a panel like this with the people who've been marginalized and who are suffering.
And some of them could actually be rich people.
Yes, maybe.
No,
yes,
just because you're
rich in spirit, but not rich in.
But even, I'm just playing the devil's advocate. There are people I know who are very wealthy, but who feel that they have no agency.
Sure, I get that. Yeah, we feel that a lot here, right?
Yeah.
So with what Dr. Kwa mentioned, right? It's wonderful to be here to listen to all these great minds talking about this, right? But I actually asked, what difference then does it make for the man on the ground? So I had the same question as Vishwa actually. So where do we start? What is this Singapore that we are building, and what is this dream? So if we go on saying that enough is being done for the poor in Singapore, and that was said by a couple of panelists here, that our government is doing a lot, then we just sit back on our laurels and say it's being done, and I don't think we get anywhere. So that was one lever that we really need to look at, to be critical of our policies and our processes right now. The poor are definitely not feeling dignified, especially in the last year. But a lot has been spent.
Is there a reason? The word
I
dignity,
think the processes, means testing is one. The processes of accessing the financial support that comes.
It's not dignified. It doesn't.
It is not.
No,
it doesn't. It doesn't give. It doesn't give them dignity, right?
What about the
So
process?
even when if you were to lose a job, right,
Yeah.
during COVID, I think in the beginning there was when everything was being rolled out, everyone is working extra hard. The civil servants are actually very, very stressed with getting these schemes out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of paperwork that you need to produce to be able to access the financial support. So this is not meant as a criticism. It's just being looked at as how can processes be made simpler, even while ensuring that there is proper assessment and proper disbursement of everyone's money. Right?
Ranga, I have a quick question.
Yes.
How long have you been in this sector?
I've been working in this sector for 18 years now.
In 18 years,
Yes.
do you feel sufficiently engaged by the government to seek your views? Cindy, yourself as well?
You put me in a spot. Well, I think there are very many dialogues. There are very many networks that we belong to, and we do air our views. But I'm not sure what actually happens behind the scenes. So we don't quite know how decisions are made. So when Anthea was NMP, we had an opportunity to have networks where we could discuss what's not working, really throw a tantrum at points, right? And point out what's not working, and then something is raised to Parliament, right? And it also happens in networks in government. So if I'm running a program, if I'm part of a particular aspect of the sector, I do belong to networks where I can air my views. So we are asked, we are listened to, but somewhere there, sometimes it doesn't quite translate to a huge shift. Shifts happen over the years, for sure.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is it because there's selective hearing? Is it because some people are heard better because you belong and some people are not? Is there such a thing?
I wouldn't guess that way.
No.
I really would think that our government then prioritizes what needs to happen, right? So my question then is, how are we then going to be very real? So our Gini coefficient has been at its best since 2001, so because of all the government transfers. And then we say, that's fantastic. We've done so well. And then we stop.
Right.
What is an ideal Gini coefficient? I don't know. How do we get there? So what levers need to be pushed, right, to get there? I mean, these are, I think, some hard questions we need to ask ourselves. It can be behind closed doors.
Okay.
It can be in open consultation with members that we are working with. And I think they have a lot to say.
Good.
So we've begun to look at it as people are not strong despite their troubles. They are strong as a result of their troubles.
Yeah,
And they have a lot to say, and we have to listen. So I think one of the values is, how do we listen?
I must say you're quite listenable. I mean, you're very clear in the way you've articulated your points.
you.
There's no reason why we should not comprehend what you're saying.
Yeah. So we'll do a panel, Vishwa, for people from
we'll take that into
Yes.
consideration.
Thank you.
Definitely. That's what you hear from the government.
I think Ranga,
Yes,
you
Zubaida.
did that very well. I don't think I could have done that. I just want to bring up one point that the issues are so complex. I thank Prof. Kwa for bringing
Would you
up.
want to quickly introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I'm Zubaida from Daughters of Tomorrow.
You want to tell us a little bit about Daughters of Tomorrow?
Daughters of Tomorrow prepares women from low-income families for employment. And that's where I'm coming from. I say the issues are so complex because even if we are the leveler, where we can talk to corporates and say, let's take women without the right education or background and put them in places like that. Once they are in that environment, it's a hostile and alienating environment. So even though if you have the leveler, there are a lot of social conditions that do not accept, people who are seen as just not right. And these are social conditions set by who? People of privilege, people who have the upper income levels that we are talking about.
Could you give an example?
For example, we put women in tech companies. Let's just say Google. It's not Google, but I'm just using an example. But, when the woman arrives there, she finds that she cannot fit into this environment. And what happens is that she's so ashamed, maybe, or inconvenienced that she will leave the job. And this happens across sectors. I'm just giving just one small microcosm. It could happen in schools. It could happen in NS or any kind of group settings because it is unequal. You see this difference. So when you say that, is it enough to just say inequality doesn't create social problems? It does create it because people will drop off the playing field and become isolated, and hence that is the problem. When they become isolated, we cannot reach them. I just give an example where post-COVID, women who have worked very hard to get to where they are, they've lost their jobs because of COVID. And when they are put through that humiliating experience of being assessed for financial assistance, the experience stays with them, and they just walk out and just, cry and, complain to us. Why is it like that? The experience, why must it be like that? That is a very simple thing to tweak, to make financial assistance applications a very simple and dignified process. It doesn't have to be like that, but it is like that because of means testing.
Seems to be a common point coming from the audience, right?
One good thing that came out of COVID was people coming together as ground-up initiatives. They just come together, and when they say, I want to give, there's no means testing. And my ladies come to me and say, hey, they never even asked me a single question. The food just came to the doorstep, and People offer rides, people offer my kids laptops, and that was such a refreshing experience. So again, crisis leads to opportunities.
Yeah.
We find the community is more gracious and more understanding of the sharing of resources.
A quick question before I go to the panel, right? Going back to what Professor Deniqua highlighted earlier on about income inequality, I just want to find out whether in your interactions with people in the lower segments of society financially, do you sense any form of envy for people who are well off?
I wouldn't call it envy.
Right.
I just call it maybe frustration. So
Anyone? I mean, is there a comparison? You know, do you compare? And you say, how come he has got more and I have less?
Hi, my name is Junsen. I'm from Today Online. I write
Yeah.
about politics and economy. So I'm the non-expert voice in this audience. But I pick up on that, and I've been speaking to people as well for our stories, and even for myself. To me, when I heard what Danny said about how inequality doesn't matter, it struck me as shocking, because to me it is perhaps not a sense of it is a starting point, as Inderjit says, of evaluating what needs to be done in society, but it's a measure of strife and of difference and of the have and the have-nots for me. There's a sense, even personally, that if inequality is high, then is there this sense of justice in society, that what people are benefiting from, is it filtering down to the rest? So maybe it's not the most the best way to put aside inequality as irrelevant, but I think it's important to use it as a measure of what strife in society is. And because if it is high, as you have said, then there could be certain political problems. We're not like China, as you've said, where there's no vote. People over here do vote. So I think, coming back to levers, and I also want to play devil's advocate and thinking about this, just throwing out there, we have looked at bridging inequalities through the use of uplifting the poor and, not by capping the rich. And I'm thinking, how long can that last? Just to play devil's advocate, how long can we think about not taxing the rich even more as a lever of bridging those inequalities? The pandemic has really shown that certain people benefit from the others. It's a K-shaped economy that we could be looking at. Some industries, I was shocked to see C Group, for example, surging bigger than some of our banks even. So I'm wondering, is there something that we could do now in this great reset, or I would say a great alarm bell, to actually look at what are the fundamental moves that we need to make?
Good.
Can
Maybe
I
this
jump
is a good
in
time?
there?
Yes.
Just to add on to that, and actually I was going to ask Danny as well. So as we talked about inequality, income inequality not being the issue, or it shouldn't distract us, I also want to ask, and therefore, why is it that we have a system that rewards, as Junsen said, right? We do not have a wealth tax for the rich, right? So we reward the rich, but we put such a lot of punitive weight on the poor, right? And we have heard about the means testing. It takes many years to change the income ceiling of a certain scheme from $1,500 a month to $1,700 a month, for example. And it takes many rounds of proving one's suffering over and over again to justify why I need a laptop, or I need some support in welfare, in Wi-Fi, right? In getting the Wi-Fi connection. So I think if we are not saying that income inequality is a problem, then clearly this current state of affairs with how we actually design our policies, where we actually reward the rich, and then in the income distribution, and then we actually in sort of a straightforward sort of way, I would say that we put a lot of a punitive weight actually on the poor. in the way that they are actually having to seek assistance. So that's one part of it. I think the other thing that I also like to bring in is that we also need to look at the mental health aspects of income inequality, right? And that comes from different factors, but one of which I think the philosopher Alain de Botton, I think I'm pronouncing his French name wrongly, he actually talks about status anxiety, right? Which is very much about what Nolene has just earlier said about this birth lottery. That maybe what the policies that have worked so far has actually sort of put us into some sort of a, aristocracy, right? That the birth lottery actually determines who you're born to, actually determines what you can be. And if you don't, because of the way we define winners and losers in this society on our brand of meritocracy, then the winners are made to feel that they are winners or rich because they deserve it.
Yep.
Right? They work hard for it, they earn their keep. And conversely, the losers, the ones who are at the lower end of the income distribution, first of all, would maybe have disdain and frustration. But I think more importantly, they also have anxiety and they also think that it's their own doing. Right? So this whole concept of deservingness is very much, I think, part of this system that we have in terms of financial assistance scheme. I also want to say, if you let me, I think the reason for this, and we talked about this, and Jun Sen asked about that too, right? The social security model, Vishwa, that is based on, and this is very open, so we don't have to think that this is, we shouldn't be saying this, right? The government has actually been very clear to say that the social security model in Singapore is that the individual should, rely and exhaust his or her own resources first, then the communities, the family and communities, then to have the government as a last resort. And that's why the many helping hands approach.
Yep.
So it's not a criticism, it's just that that's the premise.
And that speaks to some of the points raised, right?
Exactly.
Now, before we move on, I have a suggestion. We have less than an hour left, and I'd like us to speed up the tempo, right? Which means that let's keep the responses shorter so that we can have a little bit more of sparring.
Sure.
And I'm going to move across the aisle, so to speak, right? So quick comments, and then we move.
Yeah.
Right.
This issue about economic development. I talked about this in Parliament many times, but growth at all cost policy, and then focusing on low cost input factor. And so this actually has created a huge problem, and it I think about 15 years of depressing the wages of Singaporeans, not just the bottom, but also a bit higher than that, by very liberal foreign worker policy. And that has added to the income equality issue. And so I think we cannot do without a minimum wage system. I think government alludes to that, calling it a PWM across sector. And we need to lift it up so that we can at least try to narrow the gap and make things more affordable for these people. I want to address some of the issues about why is the government not reacting, understanding after all the feedback. I think the question is that the political leaders may understand some of these things, but by the time it goes down to policy, the kind of KPIs that are developed are input driven. I have done so much, but it's very seldom output driven. And I give you a simple thing about skill development fund. How many people have we trained? The civil servants were incentivized to work with employees, companies with 10,000 employees rather than many SMEs that had only 10 employees, and they could report big numbers. So similarly, I think in many of the things that we do today, the KPIs have been skewed towards kind of things that actually is not seeing results. But on paper, it looks like the government is doing a lot. So we say there's a lot of intervention by government. I said it too, but the real results are not there. And one final point on dignity. I mean, I think that has to be one of the measures. We have cleaners who used to earn $800 per month. We have tried to raise only for cleaners, but what did the companies do? They renamed them as general workers. So they are not
general workers.
So general workers. So still $800. So I think the time has come that across society, we need to have not 1,005 or 1,003 like the Workers' Party said. I think I suggested 1,005 in 2013. I think we should be talking about 1,008, 1,000, or whatever number economists can do that calculation. I think we need to lift everyone up. And then, the dignity of the work. I can be a cleaner, but I have enough to have a comfortable basic life.
And the progressive wage model essentially looks at a few jobs, right?
Yeah,
It doesn't look
sectors.
across the board.
Does not.
No.
Right? And that's the point you're making.
Yeah.
It has to be across the board.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
There is an economic rationale for why you want to look at specific sectors in the PWM, which is that circumstances are different. And having something across the board might, in certain situations, be too blunt an instrument. So one might turn it around and say the PWM, it is a minimum wage.
Yeah.
We don't call it that. And it's fine-tuned to take into account differing circumstances. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, in certain circumstances, that might be that could very well be the right thing to do. I want to make sure
Just
to
one point,
put in a
Danny.
good word for how, if
Then 1 minute.
Yeah,
Just a
I
quick
think
go
response.
ahead.
in the context of a liberal foreign worker policy, you are going to actually depress everyone else's wages. So if we have a tighter foreign worker policy, I think what you say makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But we are distorting the market because of the numbers that we bring in.
I just want to point out, just as a note of fact, go to government websites. There are hundreds of programs specially designed to help the working poor. It is not, I would reject the characterization that policy has been designed in such a way that's entirely pro-rich. It doesn't do anything for the poor. Indeed, means testing is a way to separate those who are really deserving and those who are not. And that seems to me a perfectly fine way to try and help the poor, help the weak and
Actually,
vulnerable.
I think just to clarify, I don't think there's anyone here who's actually saying that the government is not wanting to help the. We are talking about the modality. We are talking about the way in which we're going
the
about it.
process.
We're talking about the dignity
Correct.
issue and so on. So I don't think there's, at least I've not heard anyone suggest that the government is not interested. I think this government cares and it wants to make a difference. But what we are suggesting is the way we're going about it can change, can modify. Yes, Nolan.
All right, so I want to just raise 2 points that I heard. One is, this whole thing about what is it we value. And if whatever we value, let's give a monetary amount to it. And if you look at COVID-19, all the essential workers, who are they? Who do we need? And why are they paid so poor? People don't like handouts, to be very honest. People want to have dignity through work, and they want to be rewarded because there is agency and they are empowered and they can make their own choices because this is what they gain. So income inequality is an issue because what we find in Singapore and in many, many places, including especially in the US, that the essential workers and what we value or undervalue actually is so different in terms of monetary payment than the very top. I just read somewhere that bonuses are given not for performance and productivity, but for retention. How do we retain? And there was, I think the latest article I heard was that the Disney CEO earned something like 65 million. This is ridiculous. Singapore, I dare not
By the
even
way,
mention.
the Google CEO earns 200 over million.
Exactly.
This is what I'm saying. What is it we value? So the way we create income inequality is absolutely critical. Because women, for example, all the care work, if it was another gender, the male, who can produce life, you can believe the creation of life will not be seen as instinctive. It would be seen as the most creative force in nature, right? But yet care, I'm sorry.
We will let that pass.
All right. But what I'm
we
saying
men are
is,
so powerful, but we let it pass.
all right, okay. So basically, what do we value, right? What is it we value? So all the caregiving work is unpaid, most of them, or they are underpaid, and then all the work that women do, they are put under the lowest echelon of the manufacturing sector, and then their underpaid work is actually integrated in the way we generate prosperity and wealth
Okay.
in terms of the
All right.
economic
So-
growth.
so
all right,
I'll-
there's
okay.
one more point, but I went a little bit too long because I
Must
got
go
carried-
very fast, no?
Yeah, all right, very fast. I think the other point that I heard is actually almost like living in the same country but in different worlds, that where we can't listen to one another. Why? It's because of inequality. You have very different experiences, so that you can't actually hear and you can't empathize. And that is the danger of having a divided society. Because what people struggle with is not seen, nor is it appreciated, right? And you can't link, and so you can't listen, and you can't act. You don't even know the solutions. So that's why the conversation, the engagement is so important, because the people who are suffering will find their own solutions, and they are able to actually come together to find a way forward. And therefore, I think that if you look at why people are so angry about the unequal concentration of wealth, is because the powerful in many countries, I'm not saying in Singapore, actually they help to design the type of policy and the direction of their society. And this is why you have the kind of divided society that you see, all the lobbies over elections and all the lobbies, the big power money that goes into electing leaders and so
Gotta
on,
stop you
right?
there. Thank
All
you.
right.
All right. So there are a couple of quite a few questions from those who are tuning in, who have registered, right? Here, I'm just going to read off some of them, then we can respond. I'll probably ask the audience to respond as well. Perhaps those who haven't responded yet or participated yet. How do you reconcile your argument that inclusive development can occur together with income inequality? I think referring to you, Danny, when median salary has stayed the same while income inequality has widened. That's one. The government pursued neoliberal capitalism and growth at the expense of equity. We should examine the systemic traits of our economic model, right? Given how there are people in Singapore who are earning below a living wage despite being in full-time jobs, then surely we should also look at income levels and inequality as a whole, right? I think that's a point that Indrajit you pointed to, because it's the inflation
The
and
cost of
other
living.
factors have taken a lead. Should we focus more on quality of life and consider other factors such as physical, mental, and emotional health and living and working environments?
Yeah.
These are some of the points that, any responses? Perhaps I'll go to those who have not responded. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to hijack this to talk
Yeah.
about, actually, I think the last comment made brought to mind that actually we haven't had a conversation about what is a minimum standard of living that we desire as a nation together. So
Across the board.
across the board, that's right. Because if you
Swiss standard.
if we look
Swiss
at
standard.
Swiss standard, well, I think that Singaporeans might surprise us. We might not desire that high level of living as a minimum standard. So I think that we might be surprised if we would actually open up conversations across different socioeconomic strata to just have a conversation about what is a minimum standard of living. Do you really need, for example, air conditioning in the rooms? Do you really need a big 55-inch TV? What is it that people need? And when there is an inclusive conversation about such conversations, I think that we might actually start to have more concrete conversations around income inequality.
Yeah. Actually, if I could quickly add a rejoinder, right? This is purely anecdotal. My own experience in dealing with, in working with people in the social sector, right? What I found really admirable is a lot of people who work in social sector actually ask for less. I mean, I find that counterintuitive. Actually ask for less. Now, it often made me wonder, is it because for you, the marginal utility, the value of money is low? Or is it because of a certain generosity of spirit?
Ask for what less? I wouldn't ask for less for some stuff.
Yeah, no, salary, or certain creature comforts. I mean, I have come across a fair number of them, and I was shocked because I said, look, why are you undervaluing yourself when actually you should be asking for more money? you know. But it's just something I'm putting out there, because a lot of people who work in the social sector actually are there because they believe in something. But unfortunately, when you go in there and do it because you believe in something, there is a certain amount of taking for granted. Therefore, you're not really paid sufficiently for what you are worth.
So
Because
is
we
that
are
a system issue? Is that how the system has been designed? Or is that
It's
actually the
not.
individual
It's
workers?
how I believe it's how the system has evolved. And it's been encrusted. Like I said, blue collar work, it's always secondary to white collar work. You know, it's that sort of thing. It has become part of our psyche. So similarly, social work, okay, you pay a certain amount. You know, it's only in the recent years that I think there's been a serious discussion about how do we push it up? How do we increase the qualification and so on? And nowadays, even now, the payment, the salaries given to people in the social sector is pegged to your qualification. Does it necessarily have to be pegged to qualification? I'm not sure, but these are questions that we need to raise. I mean, someone with O levels may be able to be an outstanding social worker, right, in that space, more than someone with a diploma or a degree. But then you're given salaries according to that. I'm just wondering whether some of those things have to be revalued as well. Yes, please.
I think that the professional work could be a separate conversation, just like how you would definitely pay doctors what the doctors are worth. So I think if we put, because social work is a profession, and so we put that conversation aside, I wanted to write on what you have just said, that everything's a parallel process, right? So the undermining of our own industry and our own skills in an industry where we feel that we need to honor some higher calling. Actually, it's kind of, you kind of self-negate your own experience,
Exactly.
that you deserve less. And that's exactly what our disempowered poor actually experience. So I actually, okay, I must say that in many organizations, including my own, just hashtag, to say that it has to be my organization as well, that when you honor the work that your employees do, it doesn't matter even if you are if you're a nurse in a nursing home, or if you are the cleaner in a work office, if you honor the work and you pay them what they deserve, dignity and pride in the work actually increases, and the entire organization becomes more productive. So so two things. One is it's also about HR practices, right? Like how do you honor the work that people put in? And the other about whether when we negate ourselves, it is actually a parallel process. And maybe we actually, when we stand firm on what we need, especially for those of us who are women in the industry, when we stand firm what we need, and we stand firm on behalf of the people that we work with, and we encourage them and empower them to do the same for themselves, that actually has some positive impact on actually income inequality.
Okay, quick question. Who determines the value of what you do? Who should determine that? Who should determine the value how much a cleaner should be paid? Who should determine, who? Of course, we can leave it to market forces. But
which is what we have done, right?
But are we suggesting that there should be greater conversation and some kind of consensus as a society?
Yeah. I
Not
think it's
just
far
leaving it to
easier
market
to say, let's have conversation about what is the minimum income standards.
Minimum living
once
wage.
we can have that conversation, everything else, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's likely to be an easier conversation.
All right.
So now we don't know. See, we don't know how much. We might roughly know how much inflation has occurred in the last decade or so. But what does it mean to now live a life for, if you have two kids who are going to primary school, and how much tuition fees do they need? What kind of pocket money do they need to have so they could have friends?
Got your point. All right. Can we hear from the others, please?
Okay, hi, I'm Nicholas. So I teach in the social work program at SUSS. So I will not comment on the professionalism of social work and the importance of social work education, because I have a vested interest, obviously.
Okay.
But I just wanted to perhaps pose this question to Prof. Kwa. So I think part of what I'm hearing from you when you talk about income inequality not being a problem is almost as if by acknowledging that it is a problem, we are pointing the finger at the rich and saying that they are part of the problem. But how I see it is very different, right? They are part of the solution. You said that just because there's some if there are no rich people, the poor will still be around. But I would say that the poor can be less poor if the rich are around, because they are part of the solution. So I think I'm going to draw a parallel with privilege, right? So I've spoken about privilege in a personal capacity, and I'm not going to go into details now, but there are some, when you mention privilege, they get very defensive because it is almost as if they see it as an attack on them, when privilege is basically something that you did not earn, right? But you get to enjoy in society. So I think sometimes the language we use, like for example, just using it as an example, when we say we impose a punitive burden on the poor, it could be perceived as saying that the rich, because you earn so much money, that that kind of means that they are part of the problem, when in fact they are part of the solution. And although we have said the Gini coefficient has been going down, I would say that the Gini coefficient, when taking into account all the taxes and all that, is still higher than the other developed countries. So we could be doing more. And there's no wealth taxes and things like that. But I think the key point that I just wanted to share is that I think, could it be just almost a defense mechanism that we have, that by acknowledging income inequality, and because of how we measure it, we are actually pointing the finger at the rich and saying, you are the problem, when in fact they are not part of the problem, they are part of the solution.
That's an excellent point, because really I think to a large extent that's what I believe Danny was trying to allude to, because it's not about demonizing the rich. It's not about being envious of the rich. And it's not that the rich are people who are intentionally subjugating the poor. But it is about highlighting that it is a phenomenon that we have, acknowledging that we do have people who are rich, and that perhaps acknowledging also that there is a correlation, perhaps not a causal connection, but a correlation between the two,
Building
a
on
quick
this,
comment.
Building on this also brings us back to Cindy's point earlier about public discourse. I'm all for public discourse that gets us all thinking about we're all in this together. This is a problem that we all have to solve. And very unfortunately, a lot of the discourse on inequality has gone in the wrong direction. It builds an us versus them kind of narrative, which is not helpful. This answers also the question that was asked earlier. So what does this all mean for the ordinary person? It means that thinking about inequality in a constructive way gets us to the right kind of solution that will actually help lift the weak and vulnerable. And it does not distract our energy into needless, almost class kind of conflict. It gets us to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. And if you wish, I have lots of examples about where the West, thinking about this the wrong way, has actually led to totally disastrous policy outcomes.
Okay. Yes, Nolan, quick one.
I think that at the end of the day, it is about a social contract, right, for the whole society. And you have to bring in your private sector, you have to bring the whole community in, and then discuss what level of inequality are we willing to accept and what kind. And then how do we actually arrange it so that those, because you need money, if you're talking about providing social protection, trying to provide schooling and support for education, healthcare, housing, all the kind of different subsidies. Where is this fiscal, your fiscal and your monetary resources coming from, right? And therefore, you need to have a conversation. What is the role of the private sector? How do you ensure that work is respected, that there is no harassment at work, that work is valued, that you remove your gender barriers at work? I mean, the last figures that I saw from the World Economic Forum, when they talk about gender pay gap, guess what? They say it will take 257 years to close the gender wage gap, and this was a 2020 report. Okay? So there's a lots of discussion and conversation that we need as a society, basically to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want? What is it we will accept? And also, where are we going? So at the end of the day, what we want is a future where there is well-being for both humanity and for our planet. And that's what
Yeah.
We actually want. So I always say, in fact, from my very start, all I've been about has been inclusive and sustainable development.
Right.
And how we reach there
Yeah.
is a conversation that we need to
And
have.
what I like is I'm seeing Danny nodding.
Yeah, but he's not
And-
supposed to not so much. when I
No. But
speak.
that's the interesting thing, because I think we are beginning to realize that we are all on the same page. But and including Danny,
Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
we're all on the same page. But we are probably articulating some fine distinctions,
Yep.
you know, which has taken some time for us to understand. You know, yes, quick comment, please.
Yeah, on the issue of social compact that was brought, and MV, whether does it exist today? I think in the case of Singapore, we don't see it because of the trust that people still have in the government that that they will be helped.
Yes.
And that that the solutions will come. So I think the pressure is now really on the government to really find solution, and I think it's a very difficult job.
It is.
For the government now. And relating to the point of why are the Chinese happy? Why are they happiest in the world? And also
The Chinese are the
I'm not
happiest
sure
in the
they're
world.
happiest in the
I'm
world.
talking about
No, Chinese
They're
as in
not.
not
I'm talking about
ethnic.
China.
Oh,
People in
okay.
China.
I made the
But
point,
still.
Because you don't look
Yeah.
happy.
No, but I know. But
No,
you talking
China.
mainland
what-
Chinese, you say?
Yeah, mainland Chinese.
The survey says that the world is getting better, so they're the happiest.
Yeah.
Whereas the rest of them will say, and then the point of actually China looks good. I think it's also a question of at the stage of development that they are at. The day they reach the state of development of the USA, they'll see the same thing that happens in Capitol
Very
Hill,
possibly,
right? So I think,
absolutely.
and in Singapore, we are somewhere in between. If we are not careful, we will see our capital issue too. So I think it's really an urgent issue for all governments, and I think for us, we can do it easily.
Easy, because and this point about them and us,
Yeah.
that we talked about, that Senior Minister Tharman also talked about, which is very real, which is what we are trying to prevent,
Yeah.
right? But for that to happen, there needs to be trust, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just about actions, there needs to be trust, and goes back to the whole question of conversations like this. Even if we don't have conclusions in the end, we have thrown up, various viewpoints which hopefully will be taken into account, right? Now, the World Economic Forum study of 2020 also highlighted certain things about Singapore. Since we have been quite critical of some of Singapore policy, I must say that they have ranked Singapore's healthcare and education as one of the top.
Yeah.
And that's not surprising. But what I found interesting was that it also said that in Singapore, a child born to parents in the lowest quintile, right, within 14% of them actually have a chance to actually get to the highest quintile by the age 30. Now, that's quite significant. That means 14% of the people in the lowest quintile have the chance of being in the highest quintile within around the age of 30. Now, compared to the USA, it's 8%. UK, 9%. You see, so there are some things that we are obviously doing that is right. But what I think seems to be missing here is, as especially Nolan, you pointed out, right? We are focusing very much on numbers and statistics and so on, which are important to anchor ideas, but we should also not be uncomfortable dealing with the gray areas, right? Which should make us uncomfortable. So let me share with you another very simple anecdote, right? We have to talk when we talk about access, right? Access to good education, right? I'm not sure whether there is sufficient access which is democratic enough for people to go to the best schools, for example. Okay. And there are various reasons, not just about performance in PSLE. Right? I was talking to this kid who went through PSLE and scored more than 265, which is the top, right? He could have walked into the top schools like Raffles. But do you know, when I spoke to him and his parents, they absolutely didn't want to go to RI. I asked him why. And the kid said, "Sir, because I won't fit in. Because I'm poor. The father was a plumber. Because I won't fit in." And then I probed and asked him, why? And he gave me this interesting illustration. He said, because I heard that when my classmates in RI, when the classmates talk about vacation, they talk about Paris. I talk about Batam. You see what I mean? it has an impact on the self-esteem of the child. If we don't tackle these gray areas and just focus on the numbers, we will end up missing the wood for the trees. Because really, at the end of the day, it's the gray areas that give us possibilities. You know, and I think we really should start focusing on some of those. And it must make us uncomfortable.
So how do we tackle that?
Yeah.
So what kind of questions should we actually be asking? So I think this panel is being held at a very crucial point in time. A budget is being debated on the 12th. So I'm just wondering what should be the questions. 25th, sorry. So we are planning ahead. So what sort of questions should we be asking, and where should we start? I actually have this question for Dr. Kwa, actually. Where do we start, and how do we accelerate? Like, Singapore believes that we are doing a lot, and it seems like a lot of little things are happening. Not little things, a lot of things are happening, but it just doesn't seem to be coming together to create a better quality of life. So even while we all laughed about the Swiss quality of life, right? Perhaps if you look at the Norwegian countries, you know, I would like to be working 35 hours a week. I'm not. I'm working 50 hours a week sometimes, right? So where do we start? How do we create equality for everybody, you know, without having to suffer through various policies and various changes that come up, right?
I think what you're referring to is we want equality of opportunity. No one should, because of their birth circumstances, be shut off from certain lines.
Or feel that he needs to shut off.
That, or like the example you described. This does not mean, however, equality of outcomes. You know, if I'm going to be undergoing brain surgery, I don't want a random person picked by random to be operating on me. I want certain skills to be trained. I want certain embedding. So those things will still matter. What would be wrong is if we shut off those possibilities too early, that we do not give people across segments of society enough of a runway to prove themselves. And so I think a good way to begin is to rethink what we consider equality of opportunity.
Yeah. So a quick point to that is, I'd like to put this question, we don't need to get the answer. I've often wondered, I'm a product of Raffles Institution, I think we should get rid of elite schools. No, I think we should really take it at face value when we say every school is a good school.
Yeah,
Can I jump in there to, okay. I just wanted to add on to that, right? So what kind of conversations and what questions should we have? So Louis actually brought up this point and found that actually only 1% of those in normal tech actually forms the graduating classes of our autonomous universities here. So that came from the streaming in secondary school, right? And that actually, he raised that in 2019. Last year, Ong Ye Kung, then education minister then, Ong Ye Kung, then actually talked about abolishing streaming, right, in secondary school. So the point I'm getting to is that maybe one of the first places to start is look at the policies that actually, right, increasing the social stratification, that's actually increasing income inequality, that's actually reducing, opportunities or equality in opportunities. That I don't know whether we'll get to this drastic state of getting rid of elite schools lah.
Yeah.
But I think, a first point would be to look at what policies, because we can change those policies.
No, we can, and I think there has to be the political will, and I think we need to be sufficiently confident of moving from tweaking to change. And I think there is a certain there is an urgency for us to make some of these changes where necessary. Yes,
every school, good school. I think it was a great idea, but it's stayed as an idea.
Yeah.
And we failed to really push it through and implement. So it was a good political sounding thing. Now, if you look at how schools are funded, RIs funds, ACS funds, and the funds in the neighborhood school, the quality of teachers in the elite schools and these schools, I think we have got it wrong. We should be spending more resources in the schools that are supposed to be all school, every school, good school. And we don't have to spend that much in the good school. But actually, if you look at the budgets that the schools get, our neighborhood schools are not getting enough, and because of that, we will never be able to catch up. So there's no need to abolish elite schools. I think we can have them, but we must really work on making every school a good school, as many as possible.
What I meant by, I didn't mean abolish. What I meant is level it.
Yeah.
Right now it's a very steep
So
triangle.
resources, I think, will make a difference.
Spread it. Let there be a lot more schools in the same category as RI, a lot more schools, so that PSLE, gives you greater options.
Yes.
And I don't see why they have to only take in students with such high grades. Lower it, so that you actually get in a school, you have a mix of students from different backgrounds. Now, we need to look at the economic, the social, the behavioral aspects of decisions and policies, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'd like to quickly ask this question about Nordic countries, since you brought it up, right? We have always had, Danny, a disdain for welfarist programs, for welfarism. And I think there's some logic to that initially, right? But when you look at Denmark and Finland in particular, right? Now these societies do exceptionally well in education and in various other areas, right? They've got the highest tax rates in the world, across the board, not just the top category, right? But in the World Happiness Index, they're top 3.
Yeah.
I don't think the World Happiness Index is fabricated.
And which one? They're
promote
also the
welfarism.
most innovative countries in the world.
Innovative.
Exactly.
So my question here is, maybe the time has come for us to rethink that model. It's not that it's a junkyard model. Maybe rethink and see whether there are lessons we can learn from that. And one of the lessons for me is this, very simple, right? They believe in the philosophy of sharing. It's really the Nordic culture and the principle, sharing and living a simple life. When you live a simple life, when you have those kind of principles, actually there's plenty to go around. Yes, please.
I invited the former president of Finland to Singapore, and I arranged a lunchtime conversation with her, and somebody in the audience asked her, can you explain why Finland is number 1 in terms of the happiness index? And her answer was absolutely, I thought, enlightening, right? She said, everybody feels secure. There is a deep emotional sense of security because they know that if you fall, you will not fall alone. And there is such a caring society that the society will lift you up. So nobody try to get the largest income share and the this and the that. There is a lot more sharing. So it's a sharing, caring society where everyone feel that they are taken care of in sickness and in health. And so the sense of worry and the sense of anxiety is not there. So they have this emotional and mental release, right, according to her, to
powerful.
experiment, right? Improve your relationship. Spend more time and enjoying nature. Have more time being innovative, doing all kinds of amazing stuff, right?
How much of that, though, Nolene, do you think came from, policy design? Right?
A lot.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, what is the chicken and egg, right?
Yeah.
Were they already like this?
Yeah.
And frankly, I guess what we're saying is we're not saying that we need to go from one extreme to the other.
No,
we're not saying that.
Yeah.
We are talking about adopting some aspects of that, right? We're not talking about lock, stock, and barrel, dump what we have. Actually, we have a good system.
Yeah.
It ain't broken.
Yeah.
But
Can I be the one
yes.
now that says we shouldn't be too simplistic
Yes.
in this particular strategy? There are good things about the Finnish
Agreed.
Nordic system. There are bad things about it.
Yeah.
Sometimes when that model is transplanted to other nations,
It's not
it
that
does
easy.
terribly.
Yeah.
And we need to be constantly mindful
I
of
agree.
this.
I fully agree. Can you
Yeah.
imagine? I'm agreeing with you.
I did it to you earlier, so
That's too many times.
Why do you think I got you to be seated next to each other?
The main reason is because I think you can't every particular situation,
Yes.
you have to find your pathway
model.
and your level of
Absolutely.
basically comfort,
Exactly.
and also the
Yeah.
type of resources and your culture and so
But
on.
what is
Absolutely.
important, and I'm now pulling the strings, right? What is important is this, we have to have an open mind.
And learn.
We must not, I think my own view is, I think we have come to a state where we believe that we have the monopoly on wisdom. Actually, we don't.
We don't.
There's so much we have to learn from the world around us, from China, from USA, the good and the bad, and then we now have to rethink how we want to build this society. We have not completed the building of this society.
No,
But sometimes I feel that we have already completed the building of the society, so we just need to tweak, right? I think that's what I'm hearing, right? And the other, and a related point to that is this issue of cognitive dissonance, right? Now, I want to put that on the table because it goes back to to the fundamental point that Danny made. If we start demonizing the rich, to say it's because of you that we are poor, if we start that kind of I can tell you the cognitive dissonance in society is going to be significant. There's going to be so much of hatred. And cognitive dissonance basically is this, where your aspirations and your desires are subjugated. And you feel it's subjugated. You feel you're forced to subjugate. And it is not the reality. Right? Now, that often happens when you're forced to compare yourself with somebody else. And I believe that is really what resulted in Capitol Hill. That kind of cognitive dissonance. So my concern right now is, much as we want to bring up all the other points, I think it's important for us to also say that we should move away from a zero-sum argument. That the rich have no right to be rich, because the more they believe they have a right to be rich, society is bad. No, I think we should have sufficient grace in us to say, if you are rich, or whatever, I congratulate you, but let's pay attention to how. I think that goes back to your beginning, your focus on how we can help each other. But I think the rich too have a role to play in being willing to forego and being willing to redistribute the wealth that may be excessive. Quick comments on that, cognitive dissonance.
To that point, I think we have to then give voice, right, as what Cindy and Ranga have said. And so then to move from not having the us and them is to then sort of redistribute this power of being heard, of having the voice. And right now it's very clear that actually, the likes of Ranga and Zubi and Cindy are the proxies of the voices of these folks that are probably not being heard yet, because the social value that they bring, whether as essential workers, or even social workers, that's not right now commensurate with the economic value that we put in. And if the focus that we have as a society is still on the economic value, then we still will have this disparity and dissonance though.
Yes.
Right? So as much as we don't demonize the rich, if we don't have a voice to actually share our views and our suffering and our struggles, then we're still not going to get there, I think.
It harks back to this question from one of
the viewers,
registrants, right? Is it possible to have equality of opportunity under capitalism? I believe you're talking about our current system. Or do we need to evolve a new system? I mean, that's really what we are talking about. I think we have enough time to go for closing remarks, right? But before that, I just want to ask, Zhang Chin, you have not said anything.
Yeah, actually I do have a question. So it's regards with decision making. I think at this point in time, of course we don't, if I'm poor, I wouldn't think about congratulating the rich, but I want to aspire to become rich, right? So how can I improve, or how can the system improve their decision making? I think there's this theory that I understand is that if you are poor, you make poor decisions. You see short term, right? And that's how you get into this cycle. So how can systematically we help them to be able to see long term, or to invest in themselves so that they will reap the benefit long term. So there are opportunities in situation like COVID-19, but they might not have the mental capacity. Just now someone also posed this question about mental capacity, mental health.
Yeah.
They may not have the resources to take that risk. So systematically, can we do better to support them and man up this gap? Yeah.
I think that's a good end question, right? May I suggest that we start with Anthea? Let's try and keep it as succinct as possible. My suggestion is highlight one point that you want as a strong takeaway from this discussion. One point, that normally works best. So Anthea, could we start with you in response to that question, as well as anything else you want to talk about?
Right. So to respond to your question, I think we have actually shared a lot about how we need to give voice, right, to the folks that actually in the vulnerable communities. So I think the giving voice is what we're talking about in conversations. So what I'm taking away from this conversation tonight is that we don't have enough of this kind of conversations, right, which we have to have more of. I personally come away feeling still with more questions than answers, obviously, with this conversation that we just had. But I think I'm very heartened that we are actually now progressing to being able to talk about very uncomfortable things, and I hope that actually mean that we would come to a point where we can stop sort of tiptoeing around, questions like minimum living standards, living wage, the inequality. I think I'll leave this point. I think inequality, as Danny has said, and everyone is alluding to as well and agreeing, inequality is a fact. But I think we really must still see equality as a value, right, as an aspiration. And this is what I think I would say I'm taking away.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Indigit.
Yeah, I think this issue about envy or dissonance, we are fortunate that we are not there yet. And I think, it's quite urgent that we address this issue. And I don't see envy of the rich. And I think, we giving equal opportunities and doing something to create the opportunities for everyone, I think will be a very important factor that everyone sees that they have a chance and there's hope for the future. I think this is something that, again, there will be policy levers that we can do. I think but the bottom line here is going to be dignity. For any job that you do in life, the dignity with it, and the dignity has to come with some form of wage that will allow you to live a comfortable enough life. And we don't have to go all the way to a welfare state like Sweden or Finland. But we actually have enough levers that we need to reorganize. And I think by reorganizing, they can be quite significant. We have this thing called workfare income supplement.
Yes.
We have got GST vouchers. We got a whole bunch of these things. I think we just need to put all of this together and put it into a minimum living wage structure. And I've suggested this, that the biggest worry about minimum wage is cost for all of us going up. But government supported minimum wage does not have to can avoid that. And we are already assisting welfare income supplement and all of these things. But the way we are doing it does not give dignity. The money does not go to me in my monthly wages. I get it every 3 months in my CPF. So I think we just need to reorganize. We have the money. We don't have to have more from our budget. And I think we can create this system of a dignified job with a dignified salary that can allow me to bring my family comfortably. And I will not be upset if someone is a lot more richer than me, because I know my children will have a chance.
Great. Nolene.
I have a suggestion for the role of the rich, because they are extremely important if I want to bring about an inclusive and sustainable world. Okay? So what do they need to do? So firstly, look at the way they generate wealth in terms of the well-being of people and planet, right? And so we are now on the track of the Paris Agreement and the zero emission. What can they actually do to change our economic structure? We have moved away from low wage or the dependence on low wages to generate wealth. We are moving more and more into high, basically the quality of growth. model and paradigm, how can this be made more inclusive, and how can they respect not just the sustainability equation, but also the human rights of people at the workforce, right? And then reduce not just in their big companies, but all the way down their supply chains to look at traffic labor, undocumented labor, low-wage labor. And in a sense, that would lift everybody up. So their role of actually making sure that they are part of the inclusive sustainable development agenda is very important. Progressive taxation. They should not be seen, and because the point is that we are all connected in terms of our social media. People know who are the corrupt people, they know who are evading taxes, who actually are the ones that have created shell companies and so on. So all these are bad practices. So let's differentiate the good rich and the ones that should be disciplined. And be held accountable, right? And I think that will definitely help to create what I hope for, which is the well-being of our people and our planet. Let me stop there.
Wonderful. You should be a politician. No? Okay.
I agree.
Danny.
We now run the risk of being a total love-in because we're all in agreement with each other now. Let me conclude with the points that you raised. Which, my one point, my one takeaway. We need to construct a system, a society where everyone's contribution is valued and acknowledged. This includes being open to the rest of the world. So that is part of what we need to learn. What we need for that is equality of opportunity, a level playing field. A level playing field where everyone has a shot at success. There should be clear rules of the game, and most important, the powerful don't get to change the rules of the game. You set them in place, you give everyone a fair shot. Now, unfortunately, out of that system, there will be some winners and some losers. And we've got to come up with a rule structure that says the winners don't exploit the system further, and those who have not won need to wish the winners well, but they get to come back because the game is repeated. Everyone will continue to have a shot. The game is long term. Back to you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to say this. I'd like to go back to something that, Danny, you started with, that inequality is not a sufficient statistic, right? And that's the whole point. It's not the only thing that matters. It should not be our focus. But I think the general consensus is we all agree, including yourself, that it does matter. There is some influence, but it is not. Let's not focus on that, right? My own thinking of it is we should not be absolutists in the way we evaluate these things. We have a tendency to be absolutist and go for specific numbers, and then the discussion becomes binary. No, we are not dealing with binary issues. We are actually dealing not with absolute poverty or absolute wealth. We are dealing with also people feeling that they're poor, people feeling that they're left out, people feeling that they have missed the boat, and people feeling that they have been left behind. Now, it is a very difficult thing to deal with when we have become a society that constantly demands substantiation based on facts and numbers. We need to become a lot more comfortable dealing with emotions, which sometimes can be irrational or non-rational. So take, for example, Senior Minister Tharman's analogy of the escalator, which I think is a brilliant analogy. His point is we are all on the escalator. Some of us are up there, and some of us are lower down the escalator, but the escalator is moving. As long as the escalator is moving, all of us are moving. But the only part I'm a bit uncomfortable with is some people feel that they're always at the bottom of the escalator, even though it's a moving escalator. Yep. And every now and then, every time you're looking up and you're seeing these well-dressed people at the top of the escalator all the time. It's not a nice feeling. And I think there's nothing wrong with us acknowledging that it's human to compare, and that we should avoid labeling it as envy. One of the good things that has happened tonight, this evening, I say this in my capacity as chief editor of IQ, is I'm glad that we trusted each other enough to speak our own truth. This is how conversations should be, and have enough faith in the power to persuade, and each of us having an open mind. And look at us in the end. We have all included Danny into our thought process. So on that inclusive note, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, and for you at home or wherever you are watching us. This has been Inconvenient Questions. Good night.